a couple other things. This study was in 2017 out of the University of Florida, entitled Locomotion Inhibition of the Bedbug Following Topical Sublethal Doses of the Chitin Synthesis Inhibitor, lufenuron. And this was published by Campbell, Baldwin, and Kaler, again in 2017. They did this study because there are very few studies that had looked at chitin synthesis inhibitors specifically for bed bugs. And there really aren't any chitin synthesis inhibitors even registered for bed bug control. So they wanted to know, was there any value to using a chitin synthesis inhibitor to control this pest? They looked at two separate strains, the Harlan, which is what we consider the susceptible lab-reared strain, and they also looked at a field-collected strain, which they called Bradenton. Individual bugs were actually directly treated with different dilutions of lufenuron and observed over time. And they exposed fifth instar, which is the last instar of bed bugs, as they were looking for these effects. So I know this is a lot to look at, but I'll kind of try to walk you through kind of the important things. So what I want you to look at in the top set of data is the 0.16% application rate with an N of 85 bugs. So a total of 85 bugs were part of this experiment. 36 of them died. 16 of them had some sort of malformation, with a total of 52. If you add those two numbers up, that's 52 of those 85 bugs were affected. So you had 61% of them affected of these susceptible insects in this highest dilution. If you go to the one right above that, you'll see 69 and then 67% as you go down 10%. So there's kind of a point of diminishing returns in the Harlan or susceptible strain. Now let's jump down and look at Bradenton. And the one I really want to point out is the one that's right in the middle, 1.25%. So if you look across, you can see there was 55 of individual insects, 28 died, 15 had some sort of malformation, for a total of 43 that were affected in some way. So 78% were affected at 1.25%. And if you look at about 0.63%, very similar results. And as you look down, increasing the rate at which they were applied, there were diminishing returns, in some cases even less effective at the higher rates. Now, while lufenuron is not currently labeled for PMPs to use against bed bugs, what this does is give us some hope for chitin synthesis inhibitors for future bed bug control. Now, here were some pictures that were published in that paper showing the lethal effects of lufenuron during ecdysis. So pictures B and C, very clearly, these are fifth instar bugs that died during the process of molting due to, and this is kind of the gross part, extrusion of internal stomach structures. That sounds painful to me. And again, this is what we call an abortive molt. They were attempting the molting process and failed. So the A shows the adult bed bug that died shortly after emerging from their exuvie. So obviously still something not quite right, even though it was a successful molt. So what they showed was that lufenuron showed molting effects and effects on locomotion at all of these different rates. There were quite a bit of effects shown. And also that treated bugs couldn't grip onto surfaces. Some bugs lost the ability to walk. They couldn't fold their legs up under their body. And there were, as you could see, significant effects on ecdysis, or molting from that fifth instar to the adult. They did need higher doses on field collected strains. And what this really led us to really think is perhaps that group 15, the chitin synthesis inhibitors, might be a novel insecticide for us to use against bed bugs in an IPM program. So that led us at CSI to this. So in 2017, we started the process of looking at Teco Pro against bed bugs. We exposed late instar nymph bed bugs to our Teco Pro product at a 2 ounce per gallon rate to tiles that were previously treated and dried. We exposed those immature insects for 1 hour and then moved them to a clean container just to see what would happen. And obviously they received a blood meal, otherwise they don't do anything. They got a blood meal, and then we observed them over a period of 14 days. Over a period of 14 days for the field strain, we were at about 30% mortality. And in the lab reared or susceptible strain, we were at about 60% mortality. So we were causing bedbug death with just the addition of a chitin synthesis inhibitor to a juvenile hormone analog in our Teco Pro product. So again, I'd like to stress that right now, Teco Pro is not labeled for bed bugs, but we're working towards that goal with some of this research that's currently being developed. So that being said, we do believe that there's some hope for chitin synthesis inhibitors to provide another option, especially a resistance option for bed bugs for management. And we also believe that juvenile hormone analogs generally are fairly ineffectual on bed bugs when used alone. So I do want to point that out. So that kind of leads us to the next series of questions, and that's, are IGDs useful in general pest management? Is there a case for using IGRs and IGDs to control kind of our regular slew of pests, not in the bed bug group, but fleas, cockroaches, ants, those kind of things. So again, pulled out a little bit of data to show you guys, both from CSI and not CSI, to talk about. So the first is fleas. Now, in my opinion, as a professional pest control person, I guess, I think insect growth regulators, insect growth disruptors are the magic in flea control. I almost would never do a flea job without including an IGR or an IGD. And the reason for that is the pyramid of flea populations when you think about them in a particular situation or infestation. So fleas are challenging to PMPs because of this thing called a pupal window. And this pupal window was coined by Dryden in 1991. And this is the phenomenon of continued adult emergence after an insecticide application, because those pupae are basically completely impervious to any kind of insecticide application. And what this really leads to is multiple, often unnecessary pesticide applications, because you're still dealing with that, top half of that triangle you see on the right-hand side. So why use an IGR for flea control? When you use an adulticide, really the only groups in this pyramid you're affecting are going to be the adults. Obviously, that's your main target. And you might get some larvae depending on where the application is made. But you're going to do nothing to affect the pupae, and you're going to do nothing to affect the developing eggs. The addition of an IGR helps you affect hatching eggs, developing larvae, and if you manage to get a few of the adults, you can reduce egg production as well. So all of those things can be delivered by an IGD. So we at CSI wanted to see if there was a benefit to a second IGD in our Teco Pro formulation. So we wanted to determine the effectiveness of these insect growth disruptors versus fleas by taking individual eggs, groups of individual eggs, and placing them on previously treated sand, carpet, or mattress ticking. So if you imagine what this mimics, it mimics something like sandy soil, carpet on the interior of a home, or anything like a dog bed or a tufted couch or something like that, where the eggs could roll down into a crack or a crevice area. So as you can see below, Teco Pro caused inhibition of 100% of these insects to complete their metamorphosis and their development in every single case. And while it wasn't amazingly different than pyroproxyfen alone, it got us to that 100%. So that extra 3% or 2% bump we needed from pyroproxyfen alone, we got with the addition of novaluron in this formulation. So Teco Pro is an excellent option for flea management, as going to give you excellent insect growth disruption against fleas in areas that applications are made. So the next pest that I think PMPs undervalue the use of IGDs for is large cockroaches, specifically things like Americans, Orientals, your large cockroaches, because they have such long lifespans. Their lifespans easily go out a year. And if I'm a PMP, I can't wait a year to see an impact in the population. So how can IGDs help PMPs make better applications and control these large cockroach populations over time? So this is a question that CSI set out to look at. So again, we looked at our Teco Pro product. It is our kind of shining star in IGRs. And we looked at this alone on American cockroaches. Now I want to stress that this is no adulticides were used in this study. We used only Teco Pro, and it was dry deposits, okay? So we took these treated surfaces. They were dried, and we exposed cockroaches to them for 4 hours. So we used young first and second instar cockroaches and Teco Pro only with 1 4-hour exposure. And then we watched these populations of cockroaches over a period of 12 months just to see what would happen. So using an IGR alone with a single 1 4-hour exposure at day 0, when we get to 12 months, we have reduced the population of cockroaches by 50%. 50% of the cockroaches died as a result of exposure to Teco Pro 12 months ago. And this really led us to believe that Teco Pro alone caused molting abnormalities, abortive molts, and other effects with only a one-time 4-hour exposure on day 0. So again, it may take some time, but very useful for a PMP if you know you're going to be making applications once every quarter, once every month, once every 6 months, making these applications to get population control over time and those overwhelmingly different reduction in populations. Now, the next of the kind of general pest control examples we're going to talk about is mosquitoes. There's a lot of controversy around using IGRs or IGDs in mosquito control as it pertains to backyard misting applications, not as it pertains to like larval pest control, because yes, we know IGRs and IGDs work beautifully for that. So what we did is we took some backyards in New Orleans, Louisiana, and we treated them with either nothing, Proflex, or Duraflex. And we followed these treated yards over a period of 17 weeks post-application. So we only did 1 application at week 0, and then we followed these yards over a period of 17 weeks. So that's a little over 4 months. So I think we can all just kind of conceptually agree that adulticides work. And so we're not really tracking a total number of adults in the area, but what we are looking at is population effects. Can we get a reduction in population effects over time by application of IGRs? So how we did that is we measured the total number of eggs that we found in ovicups in treated and untreated yards. So these ovicups are basically egg-laying substrates for Aedes mosquitoes to lay their eggs in, specifically Aedes mosquitoes, because those are typically the mosquitoes that are biting people in backyards. They're very aggressive biters that they're mostly our target in that part of the world. And this is what we found over time. Now, while we didn't decrease the number of eggs to 0, you can see there is a significant reduction in eggs that begins to really show up at about week 7 or 8. Now, by week 7 or 8, probably most of the adulticide is long gone because we are talking about adulticides that just don't last that long in a situation like New Orleans, Louisiana. And so everything you see past about 8 or 9 weeks, you're going to see those population level effects. So a single application of these products at week 0, by week 17, showed significantly fewer eggs statistically collected in the yards treated with the combination of novaluron and pyriproxyfen in addition to an adulticide. So we're seeing a reduction in population, not just a reduction in biting adults. So from our perspective at CSI, we see a value of using IGRs and IGDs in insect control, and specifically bed bugs. There are benefits. Mosquitoes, there are benefits, ants, fleas especially, and cockroaches. So population reduction over time can be seen with something like an IGD. So the next thing I get questions about often is about insect growth disruptors or insect growth regulators and resistance. Have insects developed resistance to these active ingredients? And the answer is yes. But it's very much more common in areas like crop and animal health. So examples, whiteflies have been shown resistant to pyriproxyfen in some crop settings, and houseflies have also shown resistance to pyriproxyfen in some animal health related settings. Urban pests, so things that we deal with on an average every day, yellow fever mosquitoes have started to show moderate resistance to pyriproxyfen, especially in some California populations. Again, houseflies with pyriproxyfen probably stemming from some of those animal health related instances we talked about a moment ago. And then there's some red and confused flower beetle resistance to methoprene and hydroprene, but primarily in food manufacturing and food handling, rather than like in Mr. and Mrs. Jones's house or in a grocery store, more like large scale food manufacturing facilities. Now I want to go over some common insect growth regulator or insect growth disruptor myths. The first myth is all IGDs affect insects in the same way. So I hope if you were paying attention when Heather went through her slides earlier today, that no, absolutely not. IGDs do not work the same way. They work in completely different growth systems, like Heather talked about, JHAs versus CSIs. Juvenile hormone analogs and chitin synthesis inhibitors work very differently. And I would hope you'll remember this just because we're trying to use the term IGD and IGR, because technically chitin synthesis inhibitors really aren't regulating anything, they're disrupting it. So very, very different active ingredients, very, very different modes of action, and they do not work in the same way at all. The next one is IGDs can't be used alone. And this is another absolutely no. IGDs can act as a standalone insecticide, but there are some, caveats to that. And that is you have to be prepared to be patient for a satisfactory drop in population levels. I've used IGRs and IGDs alone many times to control different pests in situations where you had perhaps a sensitive account, nursing home, hospital, school, a home where a baby was just born, any of those types of things. I've used IGRs alone many times to try to help manage pest outbreaks. And then finally, cockroaches affected by IGDs will not produce ootheca. This one is also false. Cockroaches affected by IGDs can still produce ootheca. Oftentimes they'll look kind of shriveled up and not quite right and crinkled, and usually they're not viable. But just because you see an insect with an ootheca in an area treated with an IGD doesn't mean that that ootheca is going to be viable. So again, you might see one, not necessarily going to actually hatch. So what are some of the reasons that I would encourage a PMP to use an IGD? I mentioned this one a minute ago. IGDs and IGRs are excellent for sensitive accounts. They're low in toxicity to many pets, people, children, animals, anything that doesn't have chitin, anything that doesn't have juvenile hormone. IGDs and IGRs are not going to affect, so they're really great for sensitive accounts. Another reason I really like IGRs and IGDs is because they're non-repellent. They are compatible with either repellents or non-repellent active ingredients. So if you tend to use perhaps pyrethroids as part of your average daily activity, it'll work just fine with that. And if you choose a non-repellent, such as imidacloprid or maybe chlorpheniapir indoors, an IGR or an IGD will work beautifully with that as well. So they're very flexible in what they're compatible with. Another thing about many IGDs is their long residual life indoors. When protected from things like UV light and other environmental conditions, they can last a long time. So some of them as long as 6 months in some very protective cases. There is some evidence that some IGDs can stimulate cockroaches to feed, and this can improve bait acceptance and increase feeding on those baits, which is just going to speed up cockroach control in general. Next, reduce the ability of pests to reproduce. We kind of talked about this ad nauseum today, but the main reason to choose an IGD or an IGR is to disrupt that development and then stop the ability of these insects from reproducing. So ultimately, you stop or severely slow down population growth. So that's the whole goal really in using an IGD. It's kind of like that's the whole point. And then finally, the last one is different modes of action. So if you're talking about resistance management or bringing in a different mode of action into a situation, then an IGD is an excellent option because they do have a completely different mode of action. In the case of these two products I have up on the screen right now, Teco Pro and Teco Trio, 2 modes of action in Teco Pro and 2 modes of action and 3 active ingredients in Teco Trio. So lots of opportunity here to add a different mode of action into your average everyday pest control service. Now, I often get the question, well, there's a lot of choices out there, Janice. How do I choose the right one? And my knee-jerk reaction as a previous technician trainer is read the label. So read the label. If the pest you're targeting is listed on the label, then that's step one. And then next is the site you want to apply listed on the label. Then you should be good to go. So, check your label first and make sure what you want to do, where you want to do it, and what you're trying to control is all listed there. The next question I always tend to ask is, especially if choosing a juvenile hormone analog, such as pyriproxyfen, can it potentially prolong the immature life stage of the insect, causing more damage? So the most obvious example here is something like a crop insect. Specifically, like imagine a caterpillar, and you're using a juvenile hormone analog that's keeping that caterpillar in the immature stage, the caterpillar stage. And the damaging stage of caterpillars to crops is typically the larval or caterpillar stage, because that's when they feed the most. When they become a moth and fly away, or a beetle and go reproduce, that's generally when they're not the most damaging. Usually the immature stage is the most damaging. So will applying this juvenile hormone analog actually hurt what you're trying to do in your pest management goal? And then what benefits are you looking for, and what benefits will an IGD bring to your management program overall? So if you're looking for overall population reduction, IGDs and IGRs are a go. But if you're doing a one-time pesticide application and you're never coming back there, or it's an unusual situation, is there a reason to choose an IGD? I think for long-term population management is never a bad idea, but it's kind of a question you should ask on each time that you face that decision, if you're going to use them and why. So as I was building this, I was trying to think of a drawback of using an IGD. And these are the three I can come up with. So the first is results are typically delayed. You have a delay between the application of the product and seeing those population level effects because they take time. You're really only affecting the nymphs. Heather mentioned that earlier. So you have to be patient with your control. Next, insects are still seen by your clients and they're still active. Because IGDs don't affect adults, you still have active insects running around behaving relatively normally. And so you're still going to see that activity. Is your client okay with that? And the next one kind of ties back in with that. And that is that IGDs and IGRs can cause insects to behave, I'm just going to say abnormally. I always use the term just doesn't look right. JDLR, just not right. If you've ever seen a juvenile hormone analog affected cockroach with the twisted wings and running around in circles, or out in the middle of the day, that's what I mean. They show up in places that they really shouldn't. They're active in times of the day that they shouldn't be, and they're just more visible. So it causes them to behave abnormally. So now I kind of want to jump to conclusions and close today's webinar. So first of all, not IGRs work in the same way. And I think we've kind of thrown that at you quite a bit today, but I hope that you'll take that as a take-home message, that not all IGRs are the same. IGDs affect normal growth and development of insects, kind of regardless of which of those three categories they fit in. IGDs, like other insects, may be used judiciously as part of an IPM program, and not all IGDs are effective on all pests, or we'll say as effective on all pests. So make sure you're carefully choosing the IGD for the pest and the site where you want to make the application, and using those combination products in places where you think they might be the most effective. So with that, I'm going to open the floor up to questions, and I want to thank everybody for their time and joining us on this webinar today.
Thanks, Janice, and thanks, Heather. That was really great. A lot of really terrific information in there. And so we do have some questions. So for starters, Heather, going back to your portion with the photos of the American cockroach and the German cockroach, how long, and Janice, you had mentioned this right at the end too, how long does it take an IGR to affect an American cockroach or other insects as well?
Yes, that's a great question. When you think about the American cockroach life cycle specifically, it takes quite a long time for that insect to go from hatching out of the ootheca to its adult stage. And there's a variable number of instars. And what we know is that timeline typically can happen between 6 and 12 months. And so IGRs, we typically see those effects at that molting stage, right? And so somewhere after application, the next time that insect goes to molt is typically when we see those effects take place. So like Janice said, it does take some time, and it does take that molting event to see that manifestation. But good question.
Another one that we have, when two IGRs, IGDs, or IGDs are mixed into a manufactured adulticide product, why do they not counteract each other? And then there was a second part to this question as well. If I don't use a manufactured adulticide product with the IGRs built in, can I mix them myself?
I'll take this one. So the first part of the question is why mix two IGDs, is that correct? Okay, so if you go back to the flea example that I gave you, where it shows pyroproxfen alone versus our combination product, you see just that one little jump of a little bit more effective. Like pyroproxfen alone works great, but when you add that second one, it just gives you that little bump of effect. And if you think about it, those two active ingredients work in completely different ways. One is mimicking juvenile hormone. One is inhibiting chitin production. And those different things can affect insects at different times. So timing of application is almost as important as the molt. So like Heather mentioned, we have to wait for that insect to molt to really see an effect. But if you apply just one and you're a little late or you're a little early, it can actually lose effectiveness. So if you have that second IGD to kind of pick up the slack, you can become much more effective. Can I combine them into an adulticide tank mix? Absolutely, you can. A lot of the reason we at CSI and our product development group are creating ready-to-go products is to reduce the number of things you have to carry on your truck. And also make it easier. You know, if you look at our ProFlex and Duraflex products, they're very easy. They're 1 ounce or 2 ounces per gallon. So really easy for a P&P out in the field. 1 ounce or 2 ounces versus, well, it's 0.25 ounces of this and 1 ounce of this or 0.8 ounces of that. It's just simple. So can you mix them yourself? Absolutely.
Cool. I think we got time for a couple more questions still. For Teco Pro, how should that be applied for something such as American cockroaches? Would it be a liquid? Would it be a fogger? How would you apply Teco Pro?
I'll take this one too. The answer is yes. However you want to apply it, you can foam it, you can fog it, you can spray it. You can pretty much apply it any way you like if you're applying it by itself. Now, when you are mixing an adulticide, if you're mixing two products together, regardless of the products, you also always have to follow the most restrictive label language. So if one of them says you can broadcast this on carpets, and then the other one you're mixing says you cannot do a broadcast application, then now by combining these products, you have to not do a broadcast application. So you always have to follow the most restrictive language. So I think that kind of answers that question.
Makes sense. And then one more, we had a couple questions come up about some different insects that you guys didn't mention. So what are some other examples of insects that these would work on? Would they work on scorpions? Would they work on part of tick control?
I don't know, Heather, do you want to take this one? We have some really great results with Teco Pro and ticks. Heather, do you want to take that?
What comes to mind that I'd like to share is when you think about these other arthropods, and something that I mentioned in my part of the slide is IGRs are a great option because they are specific for these processes that exist within this group arthropods. So when you think about a scorpion that has those same processes, it needs that exoskeleton. It's going to have similar hormonal pathways and processes within it. I can't think of any data that we have that would support scorpions specifically, but it's maybe worth looking into. It's a great question.
We do have quite a bit of data on tick management with Teco Pro, showing reduction in egg viability and molting in ticks. So we do know for that pest, we've got some really, really great data. Haven't really worked with scorpions only because they're really hard to work with in a lab and get them to molt and do all the things scorpions do. And again, they're very long lived. So, but we have some really good data on ticks, which, you know, they're much more closely related, ticks and scorpions, than, you know, scorpions and a cockroach.
Gotcha. So that's all the time we have for today. This has been really great. We've had some great questions and some great information. Like we mentioned at the beginning, the link will be sent via email to everyone with the recorded webinar. So if there's anything you want to go back and check out, you'll be able to do that. And I just want to thank Janice and Heather for being with us today. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, PCT Magazine.
Thank you, guys.
Have a great day, everyone.